Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. Today we'll be talking with Colin Aro about mountain flying in high-density altitude, which is something that all pilots should be familiar with and which you can encounter at relatively low altitudes on hot days. Last week in episode 195, we talked with Dirk Reuter about ways to collect data to improve landing performance. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out. And if you haven't done so already, please take a moment, click on that subscribe or follow button in whatever app that you're listening to me on now. Then also click the share button, which is those three dots if you're using the Apple Podcast app, and share the show with a friend. Thanks so much for your support. Now let's talk about mountain flying in high-density altitude. First, if you're one of our Patreon supporters at the $20 a month and up level, you've already seen the video version of my interview with Colin Aro, which was posted last week. And if you'd like to see all of the slides that Colin is talking about today, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, which will take you to our Patreon site, where you can sign up using your credit card to support the show each month. And if you're not a Patreon supporter and you're listening to the podcast right now, you'll still hear everything that Colin said during the interview. And when he refers to pictures that he has, well, he's talking about slides that he showed in the video version of our interview. By the way, one of the things that Colin and I didn't talk about was how exactly you should be leaning your aircraft before takeoff under high-density altitude conditions. And that's the subject of our next episode, 197. So you'll want to make sure you click on the subscribe button so that episode 197 downloads to your phone automatically as soon as it comes out and you don't miss it. And of course, doing that is free. And if you think high-density altitude doesn't apply to you, well, think again. Because you can encounter 5,000-foot density altitudes, even at airports as low as 1,500-foot elevation, when it's 40 degrees C outside, which is 104 degrees Fahrenheit. So make sure you also listen to episode 197, because the way you lean for takeoff varies considerably among different types of aircraft. And now let me tell you a little bit about Colin Aro. Colin has a PhD in engineering applied science from UC Davis. He's been flying for over 30 years, and he's a flight instructor and a ground instructor. He serves as a fast team rep working out of the Reno FSDO and specializing in mountain flying. And he's the squadron leader for the Commemorative Air Force's High Sierra Squadron in Reno, Nevada. Now here's our conversation with Colin Aro. Colin, welcome to the show. Great to have you here today.
Oh, thanks, Max. Thanks for having me. And I am a big fan. I do listen to you all the time. I really enjoy it.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Well, part of the reason I want to have you on here today is we're both passionate about mountain flying, rather important topic. Unfortunately, there are always accidents from mountain flying. You've got a rather unique experience of having lived down here in the flat areas of the San Francisco Bay Area and then moved up to the mountains. Tell us about that transition.
Yeah, I used to fly up to South Lake Tahoe to get current every spring. But yeah, the reason I really, this is my favorite safety lecture to give of all the fast lectures that I do. And it's because it's such an important topic. The NAL report that the AOPA Air Safety Foundation releases every year tells us that the accident rate at mountain airports is 175% higher than at flatland airports. And so we're not doing a very good job. And my personal experience, as you mentioned, does jive with this. I based out of Livermore for years and years, and during the entire time I was there, I think we had one fatal accident, and we moved up here to the Reno area back in 2002, almost 20 years ago, and it seems there's one every year, and it's usually related to high density altitude or some sort of mountain flying issue.
And I've observed that a lot of the people end up crashing are not from that area. It's often people who are living in flat areas, not familiar with density altitude, and crashing when they're visiting the mountains.
That's by and large true. It's really easy to, I mean, if you haven't experienced it before, the loss of performance on a hot day up at South Lake Tahoe is a real eye-opener. So for people unfamiliar with the area, non-locals, it can certainly bite you. But the same can be said of locals. Even though you live here and you know that the weather can change on a moment's notice, we have our share of locals who get caught as well. So it's an equal opportunity employer, as you might say. High density altitude is high density altitude. And if you've got a light GA airplane that's underpowered, well, you're dealing with the same issues whether you're local or non-local.
Yeah, and certainly even higher power aircraft are going to have worse performance and can get in trouble as well. But I agree, bigger opportunity for that with lower power. Well, let's jump right into it. Let's talk about mountain flying.
I always start by talking about some basic rules to live by that will keep your typical light GA aircraft pilot safe. And these are directly lifted from the late Sparky Amundsen's text. So we begin by defining the point of no return. And note that when you're flying into rising terrain, the terrain, of course, can outclimb the aircraft, especially at high density altitude with an underpowered aircraft. Although, as you mentioned, even with fairly robust, shall we say, aircraft, you can turbocharge the engine, but you can't turbocharge the wing and the prop. And we'll talk about that a little later when we talk about aircraft performance. But you can certainly be in a situation where the terrain is going to outclimb the aircraft. And so we define the point of no return as the place where you could reduce the throttle to idle and still have enough altitude for a turnaround toward lowering terrain, 180 degrees, or maybe not quite 180 degrees, maybe 145 degrees, but you can turn toward lowering terrain. And basically what this is saying is the point of no return is the point past which, if you lose the engine, you're going to have a bad day because you won't be able to turn the aircraft around and head toward lowering terrain. So this is just an important concept to keep in mind. You don't want to go past the point of no return.
So this applies primarily when you're crossing a ridge and you're getting near the peak?
Correct. That's the primary application. But this concept is applicable and something you should think about anytime you're flying into any sort of rising terrain.
Okay, makes sense.
So the point of defining the point of no return is that we have a couple of what I call house rules. Sparky called these Sparkys Rules, but these are, again, directly lifted from Sparky's Mountain Flying Bible. Rule number 1, always be in a position to turn toward lowering terrain, common sense. And rule 2, never fly past the point of no return. Both of these are common sense. And one thing I like to point out to people is that a Cessna 182 at full gross has a 9-to-1 glide ratio. And in the glider community, glider pilots would refer to that as a lawn dart. But 9-to-1, that's an 11% grade or a 6.3% descent angle. And so if you can find terrain that's descending at 6.3 degrees or more, you're not losing any altitude in terms of your height AGL as you proceed down terrain. Now, that's not exactly the most heartwarming thought out there, but you can buy yourself a little time to sort out options, maybe hit an emergency checklist and look for a favorable place to put the aircraft down.
Well, and since you mentioned the Cessna 182, let's talk about that for a moment. To me, that's kind of the minimum aircraft that I like to be flying in the mountains with. I've been in, believe it or not, 152s, 172s, landing at Truckee and South Lake Tahoe Airport. And to me, both of those seem awfully marginal. And yet, even with the Cessna 182, there have been times when I've been in those aircraft and I've found that the performance really left me wishing I had more power available. And we do see accidents with those aircraft up there. What do you think about different aircraft types and which ones you'd prefer to be in the mountains and not prefer to be in?
Well, gosh, that's kind of a loaded question because we're so attached to our aircraft types. Like I said earlier, you can turbocharge the engine, but you can't turbocharge the wing and the prop. So more power has its limits. I mean, you know, if you have an F-16 with a 5-stage afterburner, that's great. You can get out of a lot of trouble there. But by and large, if you're flying GA, you know, you have to use your smarts. And we're going to talk about that when we get into weather here. And when I say use your smarts, you have to understand where the vertical convection is and what it's doing. Because it's better to avoid the fight than to fight a losing battle.
Sure. And I guess I probably would add that all the things that we're talking about apply to all aircraft, and there's no particular aircraft type that's going to make you safe if you don't follow all these guidelines.
That's true, and that's why I said the aircraft type question was a bit loaded there. What I like to talk about are things that are universal, and that's the whole point of cross-pollinating the glider world with the airplane world. I look at the mountain flying topic. I like to look at it through the eyes of a glider pilot, because if people in the glider community up here can fly cross countries covering hundreds of kilometers and stay airborne for hours and hours at a time and reach flight levels in a glider, why then light airplane pilots can use those same techniques, that same knowledge, to make themselves not only safer, but maybe more efficient pilots in the mountain environment.
Got it. Makes total sense. So let's jump into density, altitude, and performance, because that's one of the most basic concepts that pilots need to understand with mountain flying.
Yeah, density, altitude, and aircraft performance and mountain weather, in my mind, really go together, because I like to look at these two topics as what we've got to work with, and that's density, altitude, and aircraft performance, versus what we're up against, which is mountain weather. And when I talk about mountain weather, I tend to be overly focused on vertical convection, because that is really what's going to get you even in clear air out here. We'll go ahead and begin with aircraft performance, and we can't talk about aircraft performance in the mountains without talking about density altitude first. So the ingredients for high density altitude, and that is thin air, low density mass per unit volume of the air. All three ingredients are possible in the mountains, and that is high altitude. It gets hot in the summer. And I got to say, the third one, humid, we don't get a lot of humidity here. In fact, I believe a week ago or so, I looked at ForeFlight, and the humidity out at the Reno State Airport here, my local airport, was 4%. So we don't get a lot of humidity in the Sierra generally. But if you're out east, even at relatively lower altitudes, it can be really humid, and thin air is thin air, and high density altitude is high density altitude, and that affects your aircraft performance. Anyway, high, hot, humid are the ingredients for low air density, which means high density altitude. We'll start off by talking about the effects of high density altitude or thin air or low density air, low mass per unit volume, the effects on the aircraft. All I want the audience to take away from this slide is the relationship between the lift that the airfoil produces, its airspeed, and the air density. So the lift that we produce is proportional to the density of the air. All things being equal, you double the air density, you double the lift. The lift force is also proportional to the square of the airspeed. You double the square of the airspeed, you double the lift. That's a bit complicated, because if you double the square of the airspeed, you only have to raise the airspeed itself by about 41%, the square root of 2 being 1.41. So the relationship here is that if you were to have a theoretical runway up at 18,000 feet, where the air density is half what it is at sea level, in order to produce sufficient lift to break ground, in order to keep the lift constant as it is at sea level, you'd have to double the square of the aircraft's velocity. So you'd have to attain a true airspeed that's 41% higher in order to break ground at this theoretical 18,000 foot airport. Obviously, we don't have any Sierra Nevada airports up at 18,000 feet, but if you go to Lake Tahoe on a hot summer day and the density altitude is between 8,000 and 10,000 feet, why your true airspeed is going to be about 10 to 15% higher in order to break ground under those conditions than it would under standard conditions at sea level. So you're going to notice that 10 to 15% is going to be noticeable.
And I've noticed it's easy to get to 8,000 foot density altitude there. You don't need to be much hotter than maybe 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and you can be right at 8,000 feet density altitude.
Oh, that's absolutely true. When the field elevation is 6,000 feet, you don't have to be much hotter than standard to bump the density altitude up to 8,000 feet. So yeah, that's absolutely true. On a hot 90, 100-degree day like we're having now, we're seeing density altitudes up around 10,000 feet in certain places.
Wow, that's a lot.
So there are a couple of factors that go into aircraft performance. First and foremost, obviously, is the engine. We've already talked about having extra power up front and the advantages of having that. So let's talk about the performance of your non-turbocharged engine as you go up to higher density altitudes. Typically, your normally aspirated engine is going to lose about 3% of its available power per 1,000 feet. And those of you with manifold pressure gauges see this directly. Typical light GA airplane loses about 1 inch of manifold pressure for every 1,000 feet you climb. So you're seeing the engine start to wheeze and lose power as you go up in altitude. At 10,000 feet, 3% per 1,000 feet, your 180 horsepower engine, if you're flying a Cessna 172, is only putting out 126 horsepower. Its power is significantly degraded. So the wing needs a higher true airspeed to generate enough lift to get into the thin air. We talked about that a little earlier, our theoretical 18,000 foot airport. And that wing needing to get to that higher true airspeed is being pulled by a significantly weakened engine. So in terms of aircraft performance, when you go to high density altitude, things really start to gang up against you. It's not just one thing. It's the engine and the wing, and even the pilot. When you go to high density altitude, high pressure altitude, you're risking hypoxia. So, like I said, things are starting to gang up against us. You've got a wing that needs to be pulled to a higher airspeed, an engine that's performance is significantly degraded, and we haven't even really talked about the propeller. The propeller. Just like the wing, well, the propeller is a wing. It's just its lift is pointed in a different direction. So its performance is going to be degraded as well. It's going to do a lesser job at converting the engine's horsepower into forward thrust. And so things are ganging up against us. So yeah, the only way to combat the effects of high density altitude is to lighten the airplane. And bear in mind that your takeoff distance is proportional to the square of your gross weight. So for every 10% you add to the airplane's weight, you're going to increase your takeoff roll by about 21%. 1.1 squared is 1.21. Yeah, you think about every pound you put on the aircraft. You don't want to skimp on fuel. You don't want to skimp on emergency supplies. But 4-seat airplanes turn into 2-seat airplanes quite often. At the high density altitude airports. So we've talked about aircraft performance, and we think about this in the vein of getting off the ground. But really, getting off the ground is just the beginning of the fight. Once you're airborne, you really have to think about your climb gradient and whether or not you're going to have to circle. And when you plan your flight, you need to account for fuel and time circling, if you need to. And you very likely might need to, because bear in mind that the air near ridges or in the immediate vicinity of a ridge line could end up being much, much warmer than standard temperature due to radiative heating. The terrain is going to radiate heat and warm the air around it. And so if you have a 10,000 foot pass and the air within 1,000 foot vicinity of that pass is 80 degrees Fahrenheit, why the density altitude of the air as you fly through that pass could be 15,000 feet. And you really can't cheat or fool physics. The airplane's going to know exactly what the density altitude is.
Yeah, and one of the things I've noticed is that pilots often take a lot of time and effort to calculate their takeoff distance in the mountains, but they don't seem to think about the climb performance. It looks to me like most of the accidents happen after people get off the ground. They're not actually happening, on the runway, but it's during the climb where people don't seem to have properly accounted for the lack of aircraft performance.
That's true, and that's the reason that when I talk to people of mountain flying that I make it a point to talk about the density altitude in the immediate vicinity of a piece of terrain, like a ridge line. Way back in I think it was the 90s, there was an airport in California. You're a California guy, so I don't know if you remember Ruth.
Sure, the town of Ruth.
Yeah, they used to have an airport there and a ranch that you could fly into. And I took off out of there once and had real climb performance problems getting out of ground effect. And I scooted over to the river next to the airport, and the cool air in the river allowed me to eke out a climb. And as I got enough altitude to turn back toward the airport, I saw exactly what had happened to me. The runway had recently been repaved, and it was jet black. And so the air in the immediate vicinity of that runway, the air and ground effect, had a density altitude that was probably much, much higher than anything else at the airport and anything you would calculate based on the temperature and pressure readings at the airport. So the airplane knows exactly what the density altitude is of the air that it's flying through at that moment.
Yeah, and you make a good point about adding fuel. I always tell folks to not necessarily fill the aircraft up every time when they arrive at the airport, which they may do normally. For example, over 20 years ago, we had a Piper Saratoga depart San Jose International that was fully loaded. Of course, it's at sea level, no problem getting off. They landed in Southern California, somewhere down in the high desert, Fox Field or somewhere around there. And when they took off, they barely got out of ground effect because it was a 100-degree day down there. And witnesses reported that they were tossing luggage out the door trying to gain altitude. Unfortunately, that didn't work for them, and they ended up crashing. So, yeah, I think people need to think about what happens after the takeoff.
Yeah, really good point. We can't stress that enough.
So let's talk about mountain weather.
I'm overly focused on vertical convection when it comes to mountain weather, but that really is what's likely to get you. First and foremost, I think the thermals out in the mountain environment are a bit more robust than they are generally out in the flatlands. Now, that's not to diss thunderstorm season in Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, the middle of the country. They get their strong thermals as well. And when I say thermal, what I'm talking about is a column of rising air that results due to differential heating of the Earth's surface. You've got patches of Earth that are darker than others, so they're going to absorb heat more readily and radiate heat more readily. The eastern-facing slopes of the mountains get the first sunlight of the day, so generally speaking, they heat up first. So your first thermals of the day are oftentimes around the eastern-facing slopes of the mountains. In fact, I have a really interesting picture of the eastern ridgeline of Lake Tahoe taken about 11 in the morning. And you can see a budding line of cumulus clouds basically following the ridgeline. And it's obvious thermals being generated by the eastern-facing slope of that ridgeline.
Yes, even down here in the flatlands, we often see the clouds form along the low ridges that we have down here. So that's pretty common.
Yeah. So one sign that I see that the thermals are beginning to work is shifty, kind of gusty, light breezes at the airport. When the wind comes and goes, it blows out of the south 5 knots for a minute or two, and then out of the east for a minute or two at 2 to 3 knots. When the thermals start working, you get rising air. The rising air is going to suck air in from around it. And so when you get several of these things working around the airport, that's when you get those kind of shifting, gusty breezes, light breezes at the airport. That's my signal that the thermals are starting to work.
So tell us about thermals and gliders.
Glider pilots use these thermals essentially as stepping stones on cross-country flights. You gain a bunch of altitude in a thermal and you blast off looking for the next one. You find it, gain a bunch of altitude, and repeat. And it's like, stepping stones going across a stream. You find yourself working your way through a cross country, and lo and behold, after a couple of hours, you've gone 200 kilometers or so. Not only are the thermals robust, I mentioned earlier about a picture that I had of the budding cumulus clouds along the ridgeline of Lake Tahoe. And the lesson to take away from that photograph is that not only are thermals fairly robust and useful, glider pilots obviously use them to conduct cross-country flights, they're very predictable. You can look at the dark terrain or the eastern-facing slopes and the lines of cumulus clouds. So quite often patterns of cumulus clouds, and glider pilots call these streets. I have another photograph of my instrument panel and a glider, and I'm wings level underneath a row or a street of cumulus clouds. And I'm somewhere between 13 and 14,000 feet and getting almost 800 feet a minute rate of climb. And that's without an engine. So these things, as I said, are very robust. And if your POH in your Piper Arrow tells you you're only going to get a 300 foot per minute climb under these density altitude conditions, it would sure be nice to boost that by another 700-800 feet a minute by finding a good thermal to fly through.
Yeah, so I guess as light plane aircraft pilots, we need to think like glider pilots.
It really does help when you're flying out here. There's no doubt about that. You can triple, quadruple your airplane's climb performance and really boost things. The problem is that even though thermals can be quite robust and powerful, very useful, and very predictable, you kind of know where to sniff for them. The disadvantage is that it's rising air, but it's turbulent rising air. And so it tends to make passengers very unhappy. My son has an iron stomach. He's been flying since 1 week old, and he had a weak stomach on one thermal flight. So it's turbulent rising air, and probably the best advice is to, if you're doing a cross country in the mountains, get airborne by dark 30 and be in the swimming pool by lunchtime when the thermals really start to cook. Bear in mind that if you're not experienced and you don't know what you're doing, where there's lift, there's also sink. So if there's air going up at 1,000 feet a minute in a thermal over here, somewhere else there's air going down at 1,000 feet a minute. And so if you don't know what you're doing, you can get caught in a bad situation, atmospheric sinkhole, as you will. And so again, best advice under those conditions, if you're doing cross country through the mountains, get airborne by dark 30 and be in the swimming pool by lunchtime.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Anytime we do mountain checkouts, I make sure we leave early in the day. I like to be out of the mountains by noontime if possible.
Yeah, that's really sound advice. Yeah, definitely. We've talked about thermals, and as I said, they're quite robust out in the Eastern Sierra. 1,000 foot a minute is not at all uncommon. But the other thing to think about is mechanical lift. Visualize water in a stream flowing over a log. And that's exactly what happens when air blows over a mountain range and is deflected. It's deflected upward on the windward side of the mountain range and, generally speaking, downward on the leeward side. So if you've got a breeze, a wind blowing over a mountain range, you would expect lifting air on the windward side and sinking air on the leeward side. When I say that the wind is deflected, this is common sense, lifting air on the windward side and sinking air on the leeward side. But let's quantify this. Here's something glider pilots know that most power pilots probably aren't aware of, but 1 knot is 100 feet per minute. 1 knot is 1 nautical mile per hour. A nautical mile is about 6,000 feet. 6,000 feet per 60 minutes is 100 feet a minute. So if you were to take a 5-knot gentle breeze and deflect it straight up, that's a column of lifting air that's going up at 500 feet a minute. And that would be really helpful to a light GA aircraft pilot. So if you were able to deflect a gentle breeze straight up, you could do a lot with it. Obviously, deflecting it straight up is not going to happen. But let's say you deflect it up at a 45-degree angle. If you use a little trigonometry, the sine and cosine of 45 degrees are about 0.7. So if you have a 10-knot wind deflected upward at a 45-degree angle, that's got a 700 foot per minute vertical component. And so flying on the windward side of a ridgeline that's deflecting the 10-knot breeze up at a 45-degree angle is going to give you double what your climb performance in your Piper Arrow would be in still air.
And I saw that in use here in the San Francisco Bay Area one time. A gentleman who was working on his CFI was using me as someone to practice on, and this was before I was a CFI, and we were flying to Santa Barbara, and we were running a little bit late. And so he moved our route to the windward side of the Santa Cruz Mountains, where we picked up a breeze, and he just kept the aircraft level. And that upward lift translated in more forward motion, got us there a little bit faster. So all kinds of ways to use that extra performance.
I think I commented earlier that you can use these techniques not only to make yourself a safer mountain pilot, but a more efficient mountain pilot. You can get there a little, using a little less fuel or a little sooner. Yeah. Well, let's talk about mountain waves. So I jokingly refer to mountain waves as ridge lift's muscular cousin. So we use the term ridge lift to refer to wind blowing over a ridge line being deflected up on the windward side and down on the leeward side. If the wind really picks up to a strong level and conditions are right, we get a situation called mountain wave, where you end up with a standing wave on the leeward side of the obstruction of the ridgeline. And these waves go all the way up into the stratosphere. In fact, amazingly, the glider record, or the altitude record for a glider, used to be a shade under 50,000 feet and was recently up to over 70,000 feet, I believe, using mountain wave. I myself, my personal record in a glider is 25,400 feet using mountain wave. And essentially you can zigzag back and forth in this stuff, and you'll see 800 to 1,500 to 3,000 foot a minute climb rates all the way up into the flight levels. It's rather astonishing.
Yeah, that is phenomenal.
I mentioned earlier that the conditions have to be right for the formation of mountain waves. Let's talk about what we need there. We need three things, essentially. You need the wind to be roughly perpendicular to the obstruction, the ridgeline. So Tahoe, the ridgeline runs basically north-south. So you need a westerly wind or an easterly wind, but typically the winds out there are westerly. You need a speed gradient with altitude. So the wind speed has to pick up as you increase in altitude, say 15 knots at 9,000 feet, 18 at 10,000 feet, 25 at 12,000 feet, all the way up to, say, 60 knots at 30,000 feet, just for example. But you need the speed to pick up as you go up in altitude. So wind perpendicular to the obstruction and a speed gradient. And then the final ingredient is that you need the wind direction to be constant with increasing altitude. Now, that's a bit unusual because of the Coriolis effect. As we go higher and higher, the winds tend to deflect more and more to the right. So it's a bit unusual, but it does happen. You'll have days where, the wind is, 250, 270, roughly perpendicular to the ridge at Tahoe. And it'll maintain 250, whatever the heading is, from 9,000 feet all the way up to 30,000 feet. So when we get that, and we get a speed gradient, and we've got the wind perpendicular to the ridge, you oftentimes get mountain wave, and that it gives you lifting air all the way up into the flight levels. If there's moisture in the air, and I should say there doesn't have to be moisture in the air for mountain wave to form. That's not one of the conditions. We've had what we call blue sky waves, where there's not a cloud in the sky, but the wind conditions are right, and the waves up there. I've flown under those conditions before, and the lift is just as strong as when there's moisture in the air. But when there is moisture in the air, there's an obvious structure to the wave system. You generally have a cap cloud covering the top of the obstruction, which dries out in the immediate leeward area. That's the phone gap. And then just downwind from the phone gap, you're going to have your rotor or roll clouds. And this is where you have your extreme turbulence associated with lenticular, which are up at the flight levels. The lenticulars are actually very smooth. It's the rotors that are rough and turbulent. And as you mentioned, you can not only use the lifting air in these mountain waves, just like ridge lift, not only can you to achieve altitude, as you said in your case, you can use it to go a little faster on a cross country. I have a photograph that I'm rather fond of, again, of an instrument panel. I've got a bunch of instrument panel photographs from the glider world, and we're on a milk run cross country that we do from Minden to Vert, which is about 100 kilometers round trip. And we're doing this flight in mountain wave, and you can see the airspeed of the glider in the photograph is way, way high. So in still air, we'd be in a steep dive. We've got the nose mashed way down, but we're level flight. And if you look at the altimeter, we're holding our VFR cruising altitude of 17,500 feet. So, and we turned around and held 16,500 feet on the way back. So the power in these waves is just tremendous. If I can do that at 100 knots without an engine, why then you could certainly boost the performance of your Cessna 182 quite a lot by cruising in mountain wave. And I do know one pilot that did that just below the flight levels. They had oxygen in their Grumman Tiger, and they were up at 17,005 in mountain wave, enjoying the smoothness.
Well, that's interesting. I don't usually think of mountain waves as being smooth.
Yeah, that's a good point. In fact, I don't know if it's still there. I haven't looked in quite a while, but there was an FAA written test question that associated lenticular clouds with severe turbulence. And that is true with an asterisk. The severe turbulence is below the lenticular clouds, down in the rotor zone. The lenticulars themselves, as you might guess from their appearance, are very, very smooth, and they look smooth. It's just down low at or below the ridgeline where you've got the rotor clouds going to get really bad turbulence. Rotors are essentially, to put it in physics terms, are essentially turbulent eddies being shed from the ridgeline, and they're very turbulent. They'll roll you inverted or break the airplane apart if you hit a really bad one.
It's a good point. I've seen standing lenticular clouds in the Lake Tahoe area, but if you stay away from them or above them, then you're really not in a lot of danger. Let's talk about crossing ridges.
When we talk about crossing ridges, what we try to do is take our discussion of density, altitude, and our discussion of aircraft performance and apply it to certain mountain situations. And crossing ridges is an obvious one. So anything greater than a 20-knot wind is going to imply strong turbulence and potentially strong up or down drafts. Remember, if you deflect it up or down at a 45-degree angle, your vertical component's going to be about 70% of what the total wind speed is. So a 20-knot wind deflected down at a 45-degree angle coming off of a ridgeline is going to have a vertical component of 1,400 feet a minute. So, as I said earlier, up and down drafts, whether they're generated by thermals or mechanical deflection, can be really robust up here. 1,000 feet a minute or more is not at all unusual. So, if you're non-local and non-familiar, the first comment I would make is that anything more than a 20-knot wind, you have to look at that in the same way a non-instrument rated pilot would look at a 200-foot overcast. Even though you can see 100 miles, it's beautifully clear. If the winds are that strong, you're going to face potentially up and down drafts of 1,000 feet a minute. And if you're non-local, you're non-mountain experienced, you might want to think about waiting it out a day and enjoying the local scenery. If you are flying, approaching a ridgeline, you want to approach the ridgeline at a 45-degree angle. Don't just fly straight at it 90 degrees. This is an application of house rule number 1 that we talked about in the beginning. Always be in a position to turn toward lowering terrain. Well, if you approach the ridgeline at a 45-degree angle, that's exactly what you're setting yourself up to do. You're giving yourself a shorter path toward turning toward lower terrain. So approaching the ridge at our 45-degree angle, you can go ahead and commit to crossing when the aircraft could glide to the ridge if you reduce the power to idle. Okay, this is house rule number 2. Never fly past the point of no return. What I'm saying here is that you can commit to crossing the ridge when the point of no return itself crosses the ridge. And generally speaking, I advise people to clear ridges by 2,000 feet just for safety. Ridges are relatively straightforward. Canyons are a little bit of a different animal. because you've essentially got higher terrain or ridgeline on either side of you potentially. So when flying into a canyon, first of all, common sense, make sure you have a turnaround option before you enter. But having entered, the big mistake non-locals make is flying right down the center of the canyon, because this limits your turning radius should you have to turn around. So you always want to pick a side, hug one side or the other of the canyon. And all things being equal, I like to pick the right side because it's like driving on the highway. Hopefully, if somebody's coming the other direction, they're on the right side as well, and we wave at each other from opposite sides of the canyon. But things aren't always equal, so you might want to pick the side of the canyon that's either the windward side if the wind is blowing, or the sunny side if it's early in the day, because you're going to get favorable lift, but potentially flying that side of the canyon. Other reasons for picking a side are that it maximizes your turning radius. If you go straight down the center, you're cutting your turning radius in half. You hug a side, you got the whole canyon to turn around. And if you pick the windward side of the canyon, not only are you getting potentially lifting air, but if you have to turn around, you're going to turn around into the wind, which is going to minimize your turning radius. You won't have to turn the full 180 degrees because you start crabbed into the wind, you end crabbed into the wind. Lots of good reasons to pick the downwind side of the canyon if things aren't equal. So should we have to turn around in the canyon? This is a bit of a loaded topic. I should say an emotional topic. So I'm just going to, again, quote the late Sparky Imeson and lift from him. Sparky recommends that you, of course, maintain at or below maneuvering speed so you don't hurt the airplane. You want to use the steepest bank possible, the steepest bank that you're comfortable, consistent with rules. And you can consider dropping the flaps to reduce your turning radius, but bear in mind, if there's turbulence, lowering the flaps lowers the airplane's G tolerance. So be careful there. And remember that the stall speed does increase with load factor. So if you're putting G on the airplane, the stall speed's going to increase. I'm really reticent talking about this topic because I've heard so many crazy things, including one guy who told me that his preferred method for a canyon turnaround was a hammerhead. Admittedly, a Pitts pilot, but a little crazy. So,
well, I guess the best thing to do would be not fly up the canyon to begin with.
Yeah, if you're going to have to turn around, if it's a box canyon, you probably don't want to be there. And that's I started with that. Common sense rule number one is know that you have room before you enter the canyon. One thing I like to mention in my safety presentations is a glider concept called speed to fly. And the context in which I mention this is that, okay, we've talked about aircraft performance. We've talked about mountain weather. We know that your typical light GA aircraft does not have the performance to fight or outclimb a good, robust mountain downdraft. So we develop rules to live by, crossing ridges, flying canyons, operating in the mountains. But what happens if you happen to blunder into that 1,000 foot per minute sinkhole? What do you do now? And this is where I introduced the glider speed to fly concept, because it's a bit counterintuitive to most airplane pilots, but glider pilots sure do understand it. I'd like to quote Carl Conway. Carl Conway wrote the book The Joy of Soaring, which is a classic in the soaring world. And Carl defines speed to fly as, quote, the indicated airspeed that produces the flattest glide in any situation of convection. So, as an airplane pilot, when the engine fails, we're taught to maintain our best glide speed, which gives us the maximum distance over the ground per unit altitude, per altitude lost, our best glide speed. And that's true when the atmosphere is a glass of milk. But when you add vertical convection to the picture, your best glide speed actually changes. And believe it or not, when you're in sinking air, you want to speed up. You want to push the yoke forward and not pull back and try to fight it. Glider pilots know this intuitively. It seems counterintuitive to airplane pilots.
And I think that's worth spending a moment on. I think people think that when they're in falling air, they feel they should go to VY and try to climb, when actually what they need to do is lower the nose and accelerate out of the falling air as quickly as possible and get into the adjacent column of rising air.
That's exactly right, and that's exactly how to look at it. The way a glider pilot looks at this is if I fly into a 1,000 foot a minute down, not having an engine, if I pull back on the stick to try and fight that, all I'm doing is slowing down and maximizing the time I spend in that sinking air. As you say, the proper thing to do is to lower the nose, speed up, blast out of there, and go find the rising air. So that's intuitively, that's exactly how speed to fly works. In my safety presentations, I use something from a glider pilot POH, that's something that's in every glider POH, called a glide polar, which quantifies this sort of thing. And I do have an example from GA that also quantifies it. But yeah, it's counterintuitive, but it really does work. You want to put the nose down and fly out of it as fast as you can.
And then likewise, when you reach the rising air, go ahead and pull back and pitch to VX and stay in that column of rising air as long as possible.
That's true too, and I didn't mention that. When you do hit the rising air, you want to maintain what's called your minimum sink speed, and that's the speed that gives you the minimum altitude lost per unit time. Because if you're in a 500 foot per minute updraft and your glider sinks at min sink is 150 feet per minute, well, then flying your min sink speed is essentially maximizing your climb rate. And the same is true with an airplane. I think I mentioned earlier that although you want to lighten the load when you fly in high density altitude conditions, you don't want to skimp on certain things. You don't want to skimp on fuel, and you certainly don't want to skimp on survival equipment. Some water, some food, first aid kit, maybe an axe, some matches, signaling devices, a whistle, simple tools, garbage bags, nylon cord, candles. In this day and age, you want a personal locator, perhaps. And the other thing with regard to emergency planning, I didn't mention it at the beginning, but when you're planning your route, it's tempting in this day and age with GPS to go direct point to point, but that could take you over some really inhospitable terrain, and could also force you to climb to a fairly high altitude if you're going over high terrain. So when you're planning your route, resist the urge to go point to point and put dog legs in your flight path so that you stay close to populated areas and landable terrain so that somebody might notice if you go down off airport. And having said that, I always advocate filing a flight plan and making copious position reports. It's free insurance, and it just guarantees somebody's going to be looking for you if you go down off airport.
Yes, I like to fly along highways, particularly when I'm in the mountains. For example, I'll fly up to Truckee along Interstate 80 because I know if I come down, either I can use the road as an emergency landing area, or if I come down, I want to come down really close to that road as opposed to being in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, good point. No, you want to be near populated areas, and populated areas, oddly enough, are usually built in the low-lying areas. We don't build cities on the peaks of mountains typically, so it keeps you down low, and you don't have to climb quite as high and burn quite as much fuel and take as much time getting up there. With regard to off-airport landings, should you go down off-airport and need that emergency kit, there are a couple of mental hazards once the engine quits, and actually I did Lightspeed had me do a blog on this topic last December. So if you go to the Lightspeed website and look at their blog and search on off-airport landings, something will come up. But the big mental hazards when the engine does quit is, first of all, I think what certain people call shock fog, or reluctance to accept the situation. Accept it. It happened, and take action now. Don't just sit there and watch things happen. The next mental hazard is an undue desire to save the airplane. Insurance company people probably hate me for saying this, but when the engine quits, the insurance company just bought the airplane. So don't try to do anything heroic or crazy to try saving the insurance company's new airplane. If you have to beat it up to make sure the people on board walk away safely, then do that. And finally, the last mental pitfall is an undue concern about getting hurt. You may get hurt, but worry about that after it happens. And for the time being, fly the airplane. As the late airshow pilot Bob Hoover used to say, fly it as far into the crash as you can. So don't stop flying until the aircraft stops and worry about getting hurt later. So I think that's about all I can say with regard to off-airport landings, since I haven't actually executed one myself. To summarize what we've talked about, some rules to live by generically when operating in the mountains. First of all, know what the density altitude is and know your aircraft's performance. Not only the book numbers, but get out and get a mountain checkout with a qualified instructor. Know what this is going to look like in your aircraft. Secondly, stay near lower lying areas and population centers. Put dog legs in your flight path and stay near areas that are going to help you out if you have trouble. Third, fly early in the day. I said earlier, get airborne at dark 30 and be in the pool at lunchtime. That's really good advice because you avoid the worst turbulence, the worst up and down drafts, and most often the worst mechanical lift and sink of the day. So finally, stay on the ground if the winds are strong. I said earlier that a 20 knot or 30 knot wind over the Sierras is the same thing as a 200-foot overcast is to a non-instrument rated pilot. That's serious advice. If the winds are 30 knots over the mountains, there's going to be really strong convective activity out there, or vertical convection, I should say. So consider staying on the ground and waiting it out until the front passes and go tomorrow.
Well, Colin, thanks so much for taking the time today to share all your expertise on mountain flying. Where do people go to find out more about you and your work?
Oh, well, truth be told, I'm largely retired these days, but I can be had occasionally. I'm these days with the Commemorative Air Force up at Reno State Airport. We have an N3N and L19 that we fly, and that's my passion these days. So if you go to the Commemorative Air Force national website, you can look up our squadron, High Sierra Squadron at the Reno State Airport. Our contact information will be in there. And if you want to come out and see our warbirds, we'd love to have you.
That sounds like a lot of fun. Well, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me, Max. It's been a pleasure.
And my thanks to Colin for joining us today. If you'd like to contact him, you can reach him through the website for the Commemorative Air Force's High Sierra Squadron. Just go out to www.hsscaf.org and look for the contact page. And of course, I'll have a link to it in our show notes. Also in the show notes, I'll include links to the blog article that he referred to on the Lightspeed Aviation website. And I'm going to include a link to the FAA's Mountain Flying Tips PDF. That's an 18-page document that I often send to clients that I work with who are interested in a mountain checkout. Now, I hope you found this discussion helpful and maybe learned something new that could help you in your flying. And if you would think just a moment about how much you typically would spend for an hour of flight instruction or ground instruction. And so if you found value in this show, why not consider sending us an hour's worth of support? You can easily make a one-time donation by just going out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal, or if you'd like to support the show on a monthly basis and also get some of the goodies that I offer, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, which will take you to our Patreon website. In both sites, all you need is a credit card and you can sign up for monthly donations or a one-time donation. Thanks so much for your support. And finally, please tell all of your friends about the Aviation News Talk podcast. And if they don't know what a podcast is, and yeah, a lot of people still don't, just send them out to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, where they can download our dedicated app for free. Just search in the store for Aviation News Talk. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.